So good morning, friends, and thank you for joining us during this webinar organized by the Commission of the Churches on International Affairs, the CCIA, and which will be focusing on racism and xenophobia in the Asian context. This is a first webinar of a series of 8, which will be taking place from now until December. The aim is to see how racism and xenophobia manifest themselves in different parts of the world. What are the causes and consequences? And we hope that these conversations will enable us to identify some commonalities and also on the long run, help us foster inter-regional collaboration to tackle this issue. Our first webinar is moderated by Mr. Peter Proof. He is the Director of the Commission of the Churches on International Affairs. And formerly, he was the Assistant General Secretary on International Affairs and Human Rights at the Lutheran World Federation, and also the Executive Director at Ecumenical Advocacy Alliance. Peter.
Thank you very much, Segma, and thank you to all of you who are tuning in for this webinar or who may subsequently view the recording. I think this is an important starting point for a renewed ecumenical focus on the phenomenon of racism and racial discrimination and xenophobia in different parts of the world. Of course, historically, the World Council of Churches is well known for having played a very important role in organizing churches and church-related entities to challenge the institutionalized racist system of apartheid in Southern Africa. But what we observe in recent years, and I think it's apparent to all of us, sadly, is a resurgence of both old forms of racism and the appearance of new and unusual forms of racism that are taking on an increasingly institutionalized form themselves. Sadly, I think there is no region of the world that is free from this phenomenon, and certainly no society that is immune from it. So we have begun the process of trying to pick up these issues in different regional contexts by this series of webinars that my colleague Segma has referred to. This is also based upon a mandate from the governing bodies of the World Council of Churches, which is recognizing the salience and the severity of these issues of racism and xenophobia and racial discrimination in different parts of the world, and is calling upon the churches around the world, but also the Secretariat of the World Council of Churches, to come back together to bring a new focus, a more intensive focus to these issues, and to find ways of properly and effectively addressing them. Now, to help us in looking at this particular issue in the Asian regional setting, we have a number of excellent and eminent speakers to address different aspects of those issues in the context from which they speak. So I'm very grateful to the speakers who are present with us today. We still have one speaker who is not yet online. We hope that she will join us from Indonesia, from Papua, in fact. If she does still come online, then we will be happy to receive her. But let me start, and I will introduce the speakers one by one rather than all in a block. Let me start with the first speaker who will address us today, and that is Dr. Aishwarya Rao, who is a pediatrician by profession. She's worked for more than 15 years in the implementation of HIV and AIDS treatment prevention programs for the government of India, Tamil Nadu, and Andhra Pradesh. She has also worked with specific groups of people such as Dalits, persons with disabilities, and gender minorities. We're very pleased to have you with us this morning, Dr. Rao. The floor is yours for 10 minutes, please.
Good morning, everyone. It is an excellent opportunity for me to engage with WCC and with all the other eminent speakers here. Thank you for having me. I have 10 minutes and it is not a presentation. I just want to talk. I'm not, basically my background is health, but because I am a Dalit woman and my experiences all my life have, initially we were not talking about these Dalit issues. Everyone was ashamed of their Dalit identity. But in the last 10 to 15 years, there has been, because of one, social media, and also because of more information sharing, all of us have returned to our roots, and we are more and more vocal about our Dalit roots. I personally did not experience any form of severe discrimination on account of me being Dalit, and I'm a very privileged Dalit, I must document here, but that doesn't stop me from understanding or talking about the Dalit discrimination that is very, very prevalent, and like you rightly mentioned, that is on the upsurge for various reasons right now. I'll just set the context here. India is home to more than 260 million Dalits. That is roughly about 17% of the population. And when we mean Dalit, Dalit is a generic word. It means crushed or suppressed. But the official term for Dalit is scheduled castes and scheduled tribes. What happened when the British were ruling in India? Because India is not one homogeneous country of homogeneous sort of people. And India, you can say, is a huge landmass with more than about 29 states, and each state is behaves like a separate country, and it's also, it is very, very difficult for anyone to generalize anything about any people group. But if you were to take the situation of the Dalits in India, I think there are more similarities to what Dalits undergo across India. And so when the British were there, they started documenting and categorizing classification of people based on their ethnic socioeconomic groups. And there was one group that they couldn't categorize in any of these. So they called them the casteless, or the scheduled castes and the scheduled tribes groups. So there are varieties of scheduled castes and varieties, huge layers of them are there, but all of them bunched together and they are called the scheduled castes. Now, what is one striking feature about the scheduled castes is that, or Dalit people, is that historically, in the past 1,000 years, these are groups that were they came down the hierarchy of the caste. And casteism in India has its roots in Hinduism, the dominant religion of the country. And because of the caste, these are the people that do not have a caste. We have the Brahmins, which are the priestly group, and then we have, about how the castes operate here, the priestly group, and then we have the warrior group, or the Kshatriyas, and then the trader groups that are the Shudras, and then you have the skilled people of various other skills like cobblers and tailors and the goldsmiths, different people working together in the community. Now, there is one last group that do not come under any of these categories, and they are the Dalits. They are typically set aside in every village. They live outside the village. They are in separate colonies, and they are called the Untouchables. They cannot touch others, or others cannot touch them. So this is the historical context. This is in very, very small, description of who the Dalits are. Now, once India got its independence in 1947 and the constitution came into effect in 1950, untouchability was banned in the constitution. And in we have the 1995, there is an act of the government, of the parliament. It prevents any kind of discrimination or atrocities against the Dalits. This came in 1995. I mean, there is every legal provision within the Indian setup, within the Indian the legal system to prevent or to bring to book any form of discrimination. But the actual practice, even today in 2019, is very, very different. I'll give you two incidents that happened in the last 1 week in Tamil Nadu. Tamil Nadu is the state where I belong to in the south of India. There is a district called Vellore in a village where the Dalit people live separately from the rest of the village. It's very emotional for me to even describe this incident. Whenever there is a death in the Dalit community, and there is a common crematorium, which it's a government allocated common crematorium. So the Dalit people are prevented from accessing the crematorium. The pathway to the crematorium is blocked. So when there is a dead body, what the Dalit people have been doing for years now, is that there is a bridge from where the dead body is tied to a stretcher made of, ropes and planks, and they let down the dead body from the bridge. It's a 40 feet drop. Precariously, the body is let down, and somebody down there receives the body, and then the body is taken to the crematorium. And this last week it happened. It supposedly is a very common. That's how they buried the Dalit people, buried the dead in that area. But last week somebody made a video of it, and it was shown. It went viral on social media, and that's when it really hit. We know that we've always heard stories about how the lack of dignity of Dalit people, even at the point of death, even after death, is talked about. We know, but when you see a visual like that, it is very, very, it brings home how much real the problem of discrimination is. I also visited about a couple of years back. There was a series of murders because a Dalit family challenged their right to bury their dead in the common crematorium. Because in the common crematorium, in the common burial ground, was a Christian community. They had demarcated one portion of the burial ground to the Dalit people. And that section was full. There was no place left to bury. So they buried where they buried their the family member. It infringed on the other castes area, but the whole place is set aside by the government for burials, and that led to a lot of this unrest, and the family members were murdered subsequently. So this sort of lack of access to dignity is very much alive and happening today. This is not just that. I explained this issue about death because it is very striking and happened recently. Yesterday, last evening, in Tamil Nadu, again in another village, in a town called Vedaranyam, we have a huge statue of Dr. B.R. Ambedkar. He's a Dalit icon. He's one of the founding fathers of the modern India, and he wrote the Indian Constitution. He's a symbol of Dalit emancipation for all Dalits. Yeah, and yesterday evening, the dominant caste went and beheaded the statue of Ambedkar, and so there is a huge unrest going on in that region because the Dalits and the non-Dalits are in desecration of Dalit symbol is a provocation or is a show of strength. So this sort of thing routinely and commonly happens. In the cities, it's not so much. The forms of discrimination experienced by people in the cities are very subtle and very different. But in the villages and in the towns, the discrimination is very out there, in your face, very stark. Very commonly, I wanted to track for us these two incidents to set how unafraid people are to discriminate. 10 years ago, this discrimination would have been very not so bold, but today, because of social media and because discrimination is on one side frowned upon by the discriminated, by the victims, but it is very much appreciated and lauded, and people who discriminate, or for instance, the boy who beheaded the statue of Ambedkar, he will be honored and he is cherished in the dominant caste, and they make him kind of a hero. So because of this exposure now, more and more violent, more daring acts, more in-your-face acts of discrimination are, they're emboldened to do it more and more. But let me start with education. In Tamil Nadu, I talk more about Tamil Nadu because I'm closer to the region and I'm very familiar with what is happening every day. In Tamil Nadu, we have something called the two-tumbler system. A two-tumbler system, it's very common if you go, if you just leave the town into the rural areas. At a tea shop, this is where the town will come to the tea shop to drink tea. It's a common meeting ground for people, to exchange the news of the day. In the tea shop, when you order a tea, the tea wala, the shopkeeper, he has two sets of tumblers. One tumbler for the non-Dalits and one tumbler for the Dalits. So using common spaces, going to a restaurant, going to a tea shop is also, there is this two different, I mean, that shows how much the demarcation between the people is when you just leave the town, when you leave the big cities. Even in schools, when you go to the primary level schools, children are seated separately. Dalit children are made to sit separately, and the non-Dalit children are made to sit separately. And the water in the school typically has, the water jar will have two tumblers, tied to the jar. One tumbler is utilized by all the non-Dalit children, and Dalit children must only drink from a Dalit, the tumbler that is set aside for the Dalit children. So that is the kind of very overt discrimination, and it continues today. These are not stories from the past. This happens today.
Dr. Rao, might I just interrupt you there and just underline something that you said? Yes. I mean, on the one hand, it's difficult to think of a community of 260 million people as a minority, and yet the Dalit community is a minority in terms of that framework of institutionalized and very ancient social discrimination. It is a very ancient system, but I want to just pick up something that you said about indicating that it is, again, that even this is resurgent, that it is taking on a new and more intensive life, and is being again more normalized through social media and other forces. I just want to underline that. I think for those who are listening, I think that's very important. Of course, the ecumenical movement, and I myself are very close to the Dalit solidarity struggle. It's something that I've personally been involved in my Lutheran World Federation capacity, and also in the WCC in support of in advocacy for Dalit rights. But I think that that's a particularly disturbing observation that you've made about the resurgence of this, what we hoped was going to be a declining and fading social structure.
Yes, it is shocking for us also, but we are seeing the pattern emerging, and we cannot. But on the other hand, the one positive thing about the social media information circulation is that even the Dalits are rallying together. Before, we used to be quiet. We would not reveal that I am a Dalit because I'm in the city and no one knows what background I come from. But now people like me, especially women like me, professional women like me, are talking about it more and more. And there is this solidarity also developing on the one hand, and we are more articulate about it. But in the villages outside the city, this is not happening. I quickly want to come from how, at a fundamental level, there was one case I went on a fact-finding mission. There was this boy, school boy, and again, the main road, the thoroughfare in the village cannot be frequented by the Dalits without, they should walk down the road without their slippers. So there was this 14-year-old youngish boy, school-going boy, and he walked in that thoroughfare with his chappals on, with his footwear on. He's not supposed to wear the footwear and walk. So as soon as you come to that road, because that is the road on which, on both sides, the dominant caste houses are there. So he's supposed to remove his chappals, footwear, take it in his hand and walk down the road. At the end of the road, he can wear his slippers again and walk away. So the punishment for this boy, because the little boy was just running about there, he treaded on that road with his chappals. So the punishment for the boy, there was a village panchayat, the conference of the village elders, and punishment was for him to keep the chappals on his head and walk down. It was a show of shame. They humiliated him in the village assembly. And so this case was reported. Then we went to the village and we spoke. And we spoke to the panchayat. The panchayat who gave this punishment to the boy was so sweet to us. They received us well, and they said, "Oh, it's not. I mean, they're nice people. I mean, I mean, they're not evil people. But this caste thing and this and this intolerance to someone from a lower caste being on equal with them is very, very strongly felt. Now,
Indeed.
yes,
Dr. Rao, I'm afraid I'll have to interrupt you because our time is up and we have to move on to the next speaker. But these stories are, in fact, emblematic. And once again, I want to thank you for bringing this forward. And I think it must be an important part of our next efforts in addressing racism and related issues in the Asian region. Also want to underline quickly before we leave it that this is not just an Indian issue. It is a very widespread reality throughout South Asia and indeed also wherever the South Asian diaspora has travelled and now lives. So it is indeed a global issue and certainly not just an Indian domestic issue. Thank you very much, Dr. Rao. Let's move to our next speaker, Reverend Glen Luffy. Have I pronounced that correctly, Glen?
Loughrey.
Loughrey, I beg your pardon.
That's okay.
Okay. Well, it's a particular pleasure for me to introduce you. I've just returned from my home country, Australia, and it's a pleasure to see you now online for this webinar. Glen is a Wiradjuri man and an Anglican priest in Australia. In addition, he is an artist with a particular interest in exploring identity and story through the visual arts. He is engaged in the dialogue for treaty, sovereignty, reconciliation, and self-determination for Indigenous and First Nation peoples. Glen, the floor is yours. You have 10 minutes.
Thank you very much. First Nations people of Australia continue to live with racism and genocide in a country too white to see. Often in discussion on racism in our country, we point directly to the statistical discrepancies between our people and those from the dominant culture. Statistics on incarceration, health, stolen children, poverty and education, and use these as indicators of racism. They are indeed important points to make, and they are evidence of racism in policy making and unthinking commentary. They are human rights or social justice issues arguably underpinned by racist attitudes, but they are not the whole story. They are the outward evidence of an inner and hidden neo-colonial willful blindness on behalf of those in power and the wider Australian population, both those of European descent and those who have come here from other places in recent times. Staying with issues as the evidence of racism allows people to get off the hook. They can talk about improvements against government targets, progress to assist Aboriginal people, and to tell heroic white stories of themselves or family members as teachers or nurses in remote areas. They can do this without being challenged to see that they and theirs are part of a problem that didn't exist BC. BC means before Cook. Racism in Australia today is much more civilised and palatable than in previous years. No longer are we hunted down, poisoned, or removed to missions where our language, culture and spirituality was replaced by English, the Western canon, or Christianity. We are still incarcerated at levels way beyond the rest of the population. Our children are being removed from their families at rates greater than previous. Our health and education lag far behind, and our levels of poverty, particularly in remote communities, remains deplorable. Catherine Murphy, in an article entitled Australia Entering Second Convict Age as Imprisonment Rates Soar in today's Guardian's online newspaper, quotes research by Andrew Lee, which finds that for Indigenous Australians, the incarceration trends are even more worrying. The research shows that over the past 3 decades, the share of Indigenous adults in prison has more than doubled, from 1,124 per 100,000 adults in 1990 to 2,481 per 100,000 adults in 2018. Indigenous Australians are now more likely to be in jail than African Americans. These things continue, but under a polite haze of whiteness that nods respectfully and says one or more of the following 4 points. Well, that was a long time ago and I wasn't involved. Or, that's sad. Yet, you know, bad things happen to women, LGBTQI people, disabled people, etc., etc. Or, what about? And they add names of high-profile First Nation Australians. They are doing well. The implication is, why can't all the rest of you? And finally, oh yes, I know all about that. I've spent time in Central Australia. The fact that the majority of First Nations people live in the midst of the white haze in urban and major cities and not in Central Australia is overlooked because we don't necessarily look like the stereotypical Aboriginal and our art contains few dots. The fact is that the majority of our people now look a little more like me, good looking and intelligent, than the stereotypical understanding that we all have dark skin. Behind me on the wall is a self-portrait entitled Living in a White Haze, Being Black in Australia. It is a commentary on both my own experience, the experience of other individuals, and our people as a whole. We're not seen, but we can see what is happening. We're not heard because we have no voice. Our mouth has been painted over. And no one talks with us because our ears have been painted out. They don't want us to hear. This painting reflects the willful blindness of Australia to the invitation by our people as articulated in the Statement of the Heart for voice, treaty, truth-telling and reconciliation, which was dismissed out of hand by our Prime Minister in 2017 and again in 2019, just a few months ago, by our federal government. The white haze is a much more difficult form of racism to address. It's nice, outwardly respectful, and reflects the overwhelming view mainstream Australians have on themselves. They are good people, and good people cannot and do not do bad things, especially to the underdog or down and out, a concept that underpins the Australian identity myth. It allows people to view the world and those in it from a certain point or place in time and space. Colonialism without the guilt. It prevents them from seeing others for who they are and for what they have and are experiencing. It is both an individual not seeing and a systemic not seeing. Each empowers the other to ensure white hegemony remains central to the forming of an acceptable understanding of Aboriginal identity. It permeates how societies see Aboriginal people. They can be successful sportsmen and women, but they cannot have a voice that challenges stereotypes. Nicky Winmar or Adam Goodes may be an example. They can be successful movie stars, but are questioned when they choose to live a traditional life. They can be successful journalists, lawyers, professors, but they will always have the prefix Aboriginal or similar attached to their name to show that they are different, not the same. Aboriginal art is identified as such by what white people like, reducing artists to the exotic outsider and more. The white haze covers up the authenticity and beingness of Aboriginal people, individually and as a whole, in order to maintain power and control over the disputed and unresolved issues of sovereignty in this country. It is a continuation of the process of no one being here when the land was stolen. And if there was someone here, then and now, we can't see them, except through a white haze that renders them out of view and irrelevant. The white haze did not and does not value our languages, spiritualities, cultures and land use. and has forcibly replaced them with English, Christianity, Western culture, and land use practices from other places, all with tragic results for our people and our country. We are the replaced people, and we continue to be replaced by identity politics, political manoeuvring, and denial of both our existence and our place as a sovereign people who have never ceded their sovereignty to whiteness. The white haze covers up the potentiality of our people to be, unless they become like the dominant culture in every way and disappear completely from sight. That seems to be the ongoing plan of white Australia. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Glen. Of course, this presentation you've made speaks to me very personally as an Australian national, so I'm very grateful that we could hear from you today. I wonder, I could just invite your, certainly 3 weeks home leave in Australia makes me no authority on the current situation in the country. However, I was struck on visiting the National Museum of Australia I felt a very strong and sympathetic presentation of Aboriginal culture, First Nations culture in that context. And it made me wonder whether there have been, while I affirm all of the observations you've made and the statistical realities for First Nations people in Australia, I wonder whether you feel that there's been any progress at all made in terms of valuing Aboriginal culture in the public discourse, in education and elsewhere in Australia at the moment.
Look, I would accept that there has been improvements and there's been efforts made by various organisations to include Aboriginal art, culture within various institutions. The difficulty that I think is the case is much of it is doesn't cut through in the political and the decision and policy making end of our country. Yeah. I would agree that in talking to the average Australian in the street, and they do have an understanding and a willingness and a compassion towards the situation, but don't have any capacity to make the changes. And it's the political issue that is the big issue. I have confidence going forward. I think the younger generation coming through. I did a program with a bunch of preschoolers last week, and I got a card from a 4-year-old boy that clearly outlined the whole process of the stolen generation. And I thought to myself, perhaps we have a chance. I'm just not so sure those kind of things within national icons like that actually cut across the real issues and give us a voice.
I agree. Okay, well, thank you very much for that comment. Again, I think it's very important to take a lead from the demonstrable statistics that Glen has presented and the realities for First Nations people in Australia, which remain as he has described. And that also is reflected in the political dispensation and lack of action in addressing them. Thank you, Glen. Then let us move to our, well, in fact, our third speaker is not online. So I'm just going to say a few words to at least raise the issue in the framework of this webinar, because Dr. Fransina Yoteni, who would have spoken in our advertised list now, is a senior lecturer at the Theological School in Jayapura, West Papua, which is an Indonesian province on the island that is shared with Papua New Guinea. She is an Indigenous Papuan woman and teaches subjects such as peace, theology, transformation leadership, and transformational learning for Indigenous Papuans. Now, I was privileged to take part in an international ecumenical delegation visit to Papua and West Papua in February this year. And I cannot let this moment pass without at least saying a few words to highlight that issue in Fransina's absence. This is a situation that is so little on the radar screen that even those of us who live or have lived, as I have, in the immediate neighbourhood of this situation have little, if any, understanding of what is going on there. And that is also partly by design, because the provinces of Papua and West Papua are essentially no-go territories. There is very little international access, very little information, very little exposure of the realities on the ground. However, we know from various sources that we have been working with for many years that the rates of, for example, extrajudicial killings and other sharp-end human rights violations in Papua are at extremely high levels and have remained so for many years without reduction, despite a lot of rhetoric by governmental authorities. But beyond that, the larger part of the iceberg that is even more deeply hidden are the endemic social and economic rights violations affecting the indigenous Papuan people. As a result of transmigration from elsewhere in Indonesia, the indigenous Papuans have now become a minority in their own territory, and that, of course, also represents a future trajectory. What we observed was a situation in which the indigenous Papuans are systematically marginalized and excluded from the development that is occurring in Papua, but a form of development that is not for them, and moreover, actually undermines their traditional livelihoods and values and culture. It is really a catastrophe that is occurring in Papua for the indigenous people. And I really hope that we collectively in the ecumenical movement, but also elsewhere in global civil society, can do more to raise this issue to international attention and to demand action to address the realities for indigenous Papuan people. So, thank you. Let me pass now to the fourth on our list of speakers, David McIntosh, who is co-director of the Center for Minority Issues and Mission in Tokyo, Japan. This is an institution that opened in April 2017 and was established as a Christian response to a surge in racist activity in Japan since 2012. The Center is an ecumenical initiative led by the Presbyterian Church in Canada mission partner, the Korean Christian Church in Japan, in collaboration with other Japanese churches and Christian organizations and international church partners, including the United Church of Canada. David, welcome. Thank you for being with us. The floor is yours. You have 10 minutes.
All right, I've got my microphone on. Hello, everybody. It's a pleasure and an honor to spend this time with you from Japan. As Peter just introduced, it's the institution that I work for, the Center for Minority Issues and Mission, is still a very young organization, but there's a strong history of ecumenical collaboration in issues surrounding minority communities in Japan. I just, in the case of Japan, there are different periods in history that have contributed to the formation of different types of minorities within Japanese society. So I just thought I'd take my time to focus on sort of 5 specific groups within this array to give you an idea of just how history has played a part in forming these different communities. Some of the similarities, hopefully I can draw out some of the similarities that bind their experiences together, but some of the distinct aspects of their experience as well. I'll begin by talking first about the Okinawan people. The islands of Okinawa are off the south of Japan. They're sort of halfway between the southernmost main island of Japan and Taiwan. The islands used to be known as the Ryukyu Kingdom, and it had its own proud history of peaceful trading with China and Japan for several centuries. Until 1609, when it was invaded and came under the control of the Satsuma, a southern feudal domain in Japan. From there, it went through a period of being controlled by this southern feudal domain until 1872, when it was officially made part of the Japanese government. The central government of Japan sort of entered the modern era in the 1850s, when it was opened up to the world essentially by force after about 2 centuries of isolation. And so it was at about this time that the new modernizing central government turned Ryukyu into what is now named Okinawa. Ever since then, this was at a time when Japan was racing towards modernization. It was trying to prove itself on the world stage that it deserved to be counted among leading nations of the world. So it was racing towards modernization, and one of the things that it did was adopt textile technologies, modern shipbuilding technologies, after surveying Europe and North America for modern technologies, brought these to Japan. And Okinawans were imported to many of the major cities in Japan to serve as a workforce there. So diaspora communities of Okinawans were created in several major centers in Japan, Osaka being one of them. It's really in the modern area of Japan that Okinawans really came to see themselves as part of Japan, but in that modern Japan, they were treated as second-class citizens, low-wage labor, and this continued until the Second World War. The Pacific War happened, and Okinawa became the only Japanese territory that became a major battleground. The Battle of Okinawa, one of the nicknames that it has is the Storm of Steel. There was terrible carnage that occurred there. Estimates are that about 1/4 of the entire population of Okinawa was killed in the Battle of Okinawa. And at the end of the Second World War, Okinawa came under United States rule until 1972. And so Okinawa, which people of Okinawa see themselves as having a proud, peaceful tradition, but ever since the Second World War, it has become sort of like a floating military base for American military. About 75% of the American military presence in Japan is concentrated in this very small island of Okinawa. So the Okinawan people, even though many of them will say, I'm Japanese and Japanese first and Okinawan second, there are many people in Okinawa who feel that even today their demands for removal of U.S. bases from their land continues to be unheard, and they're still being treated as second-class citizens. So there's one group. The second group I'll mention is the Ainu people. We go from the south in Okinawa to the north in Hokkaido. It's the northern main island of Japan. These are the indigenous people of the north. The Ainu lived as a hunting, gathering, and trading over a very expansive area stretching as far as the mainland, the coastal mainland of Russia for several centuries. But at about the same time that Okinawa was absorbed into Japan, the central government of Japan started sending growing numbers of mainland Japanese people up into the north to settle Ainu lands. And this was accompanied with assimilation policies that removed their rights to perform their cultural rights. It also forced them to learn Japanese language. In many cases, I'm Canadian, but in many cases, Ainu were forbidden to speak their own language, much like Native Canadians were forced to not speak their own languages during this assimilation period. So there was maybe 2 or 3 generations of Ainu people who grew up under these very strong assimilation policies, a sort of a lost generation, if you will, or lost 2 or 3 generations. Earlier, Aishwarya, sorry if I'm mispronouncing your name, you were mentioning that people of Dalit background for a generation or 2 were felt embarrassed or ashamed to identify their own background as Dalit. The same thing was happening among the Ainu people. It's only recently that there's been a resurgence movement, but in the case of the Ainu, the Japanese government, it was only 2008 that the Japanese government officially recognized the Ainu as an indigenous people. Up until then, the Japanese government has sort of maintained this myth of Japanese homogeneity and has been reticent to acknowledge that there are indigenous groups within Japan. But in 2008, just before a G8 meeting was going to be held in the former Ainu territories, they recognized them as an indigenous group, sort of as many people are cynically see it as a cynical PR move. So the Ainu have received recognition. Oh, that's already 10 minutes, is it?
Time flies when you're having fun.
I'll try to make the rest as quick as possible. So the Ainu, although they have received only recently recognition as an indigenous people, there's still no moves taken by the Japanese government to address historical injustices, such as their loss of land or their loss of rights to hunt and gather according to their traditions and so on. So these are issues that still confront the Ainu. The Buraku people, just very quickly, are a very long discriminated group in Japanese society. There was for several centuries a sort of a Buddhism-based caste system in place in Japan as well. And so the Buraku, much like the Dalit, were people who were sort of outside of the formal class structure, the sort of the sub-caste group who were engaged often in trades that were considered under Buddhist worldview to be unclean or whatever. In the modern area, that caste system has been eliminated, and the Japanese government has taken steps to overcome these historical injustices, but there are still pockets of discrimination and prejudice that affect people of the Buraku background. For example, when they want to get married, families might check into their background to make sure that they don't have a Buraku background, for example. This happens, and sometimes in places of employment as well. So the Buraku people is the third group. Koreans in Japan. I grew up with Koreans in Japan. These are a group, this would be the largest people of foreign roots in Japan, about 500,000 across Japan. These are descendants of those who came to Japan before and during the Second World War, at a time when Koreans, because Korea was occupied by Japan and annexed and made part of Japan, they lived here, they came here and lived here and worked here officially as Japanese citizens. But as soon as the Second World War ended, their Japanese citizenship was stripped, and they lost many of the citizens' rights that they had up until then. So again, for example, the right to have a Japanese national pension, the right to live here without fear of being arbitrarily removed from Japan. These things have been removed. So improvements have happened over the last 70 years since the end of the war, but there are still attitudes of discrimination towards Koreans. And whenever hate speech arises in Japan, it tends to be the Koreans who are targeted. And whenever there is tension between Japan or the United States and North Korea, then all of this is dredged up again, and Koreans are targeted. So this is another group. And then the last group is migrant laborers. The Japanese economy is in greater and greater need due to low birth rates of foreign labor to keep the economy going. And so there are growing numbers of workers from foreign countries who are coming here. And because Japanese people still carry, in general, many Japanese people still carry this notion that they are a homogeneous nation, that there's a very, they have a very thin skin when it comes to feeling threatened by change. And so I think as a society, xenophobia is something that can emerge quite quickly and sharply in this country. So migrant laborers are sometimes targeted by this. The Japanese government has introduced laws that make it possible for migrant laborers to come, but the current migrant labor laws, make it very difficult for people to come and bring their families, or for them to stay for longer than 5 years. So there are still many ways in which the Japanese government could improve the security the security and dignity of migrant laborers coming from other countries. So that's just a very quick survey, but hopefully I've been able to indicate when we talk about minorities in Japan, there's really quite a variety of groups that have very different historical roots and issues. So thank you.
Thank you very much, David, for introducing us, giving us this survey of situations in the Japanese context and affected communities. Just one very quick comment from my side. I'm sure that Aishwarya will have well noted the very, very close similarities between the systems of discrimination and the processes of discrimination experienced by the Buraku people, and of course the phenomenon of untouchability and the impact on Dalits in India and South Asia. Before I introduce the next speaker, I have to make a little apology because unfortunately I'm obliged at 10 o'clock our time here in Geneva in about 5 minutes' time to leave this meeting and move to another commitment. And at that time, my colleague Segma will continue the leadership and moderation of the meeting. What I would like to say, though, to all the speakers, perhaps when we finish the series of presentations, I'd be interested, and I will hear from Segma afterwards, or I will see the recording. I'd be interested for some conversation among the speakers to identify similarities in the phenomena that you are observing in your own contexts, similar challenges, or indeed differences in the phenomenon that you are addressing. I'm particularly keen through this process of webinars to identify what it is what are the main drivers of this apparent resurgence of racism, racial discrimination and related phenomena in so many different parts of the world. So your reflections among each other will be very helpful to us, I think, in moving this discussion further forward. So then, now let me introduce our fifth speaker, Mr. Ricardo Tsonga, who is a member of the UN Working Group of Experts on People of African Descent. He is an assistant professor at the De La Salle University College of Law in the Philippines, where he teaches constitutional law and international law. He is a member of the Philippine Bar, and he is the regional coordinator of the National Capital Region of the Free Legal Assistance Group, the oldest and largest organization of human rights lawyers in the Philippines. Mr. Tsonga, we're delighted that you could join us for this webinar. Thank you very much. We're looking forward to hearing you. The floor is yours. You have 10 minutes.
I'm equally delighted, Peter. It's a pleasure to meet all of you, Segma, the other organizers, other speakers, participants. My focus will be on Africans and people of African descent in Asia, racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerance against people of African descent exist in various forms in Asian society today. A range of international laws help address the problem of discrimination. These include the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, which establishes the Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination to supervise its implementation. There are also United Nations charter-based bodies like the UN Special Rapporteur on Contemporary Forms of Racism, Racial Discrimination, Xenophobia, and Related Intolerance, and the UN Working Group of Experts on People of African Descent. The Association of Southeast Asian Nations Declaration on Human Rights likewise prohibits discrimination on the basis of race. In examining critically the various forms of racial discrimination taking place in Asia, I will proceed along the lines of the three themes of the International Decade for People of African Descent and its program of activities. These themes are recognition, justice, and development. First, recognition. People of African descent are not being counted in Asia. In the Arab world and the Indian Ocean world, people of African descent are descendants of military leaders, merchants, enslaved Africans, and various migrants. But today, we do not know the number of people of African descent in these places on account of their assimilation into the countries in this part of the world. The same is true of people of African descent who have arrived in Asia in contemporary times as asylum seekers and as economic migrants. In Japan, where there was some discussion in Japan a while ago, I'd like to add, after an official visit in the country in 2005, the Special Rapporteur on Contemporary Forms of Racism, Racial Discrimination, and Xenophobia, it found racial discrimination and xenophobia in Japan, and marginalization and economic and social vulnerability of minorities in the fields of employment, housing, health, and education. In its 2014 concluding observations, the Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination expressed concern about reports of racial discrimination in Japan faced by some refugees and asylum seekers, including Africans, at work, at school, and in their interaction with public institutions and local communities. There are also African migrants in China. In Guangzhou, one of the biggest cities in China, a part of the city is being called Chocolate City. They come from Cameroon, the migrants, Republic of Congo, Liberia, Nigeria, Senegal, Somalia, South Africa, and Gambia. Now, from the perspective of justice, people of African descent face various forms of injustice in Asia. Racism exists in many forms. Negative stereotypes and black faces are a disturbing practice in certain parts of Asia. The use of Chocolate City to describe a place in Asia, in China in particular, with people of African descent is an example. There is more. In Thailand, the Dunkin' Donuts television commercial featured a lady wearing a black face. This advertisement from Dunkin' Donuts Thai division put the American pastry maker on the defensive, and critics in America cry racism. It was an advertisement for the company's charcoal donut, which displayed a young woman wearing pink lipstick and complete blackface makeup. The woman held up a partially eaten chocolate donut next to text that read, "Break every rule of deliciousness." The charcoal donut was not the first Thai ad to be called racist. Thailand has been home to a brand of mops like Black Man, featuring the titular character in a tuxedo and its logo. Another Thai product, a skin whitening cream, advertised that lighter-skinned people were more attractive to employers, and a black herbal toothpaste maker ran television commercials with the tagline, "Appearance can be deceiving." Another ad by the same company stated, "It's black, but it's good." Characters in a traditional play in Thailand also wear black faces. In Thailand, actors darken their faces to portray the Negrito of Thailand in a popular play by King Chulalongkorn. This play has been turned into a musical and a movie. In the Philippines, characters in movies and television series have also worn black faces. These include Nita Negrita and Cofradia. In a Philippine soap opera called Nita Negrita, a half African Filipina character wears a crude makeup job. In the now canceled series, the dark-skinned girl is cursed and tormented from birth. There was an uproar. A Facebook page titled Nita Negrita as a Racist Show. It stated, "We have nothing against teen actress Barbie Forteza, who portrayed the character. We don't hate her. We dislike the concept of the show, Nita Negrita. It brings on the hate and discrimination towards dark-skinned Pinoys." Barbie Forteza is the name of the actress who played the title role. The term Pinoys is a reference to Filipinos and Filipinas. Cofradia, a novel by Dominador Ad Castillo, was first made into a Philippine movie in 1953. There was a remake of the movie in 1973. Both films were a success in the box office. Cofradia tells a story of a girl who is afraid to love or even mingle with people because of her dark complexion. All that will change, however, when she gets hold of a magic candle that will turn her into a fair-skinned lady. Another planned remake for television has been cancelled because of an outcry over racist concerns. According to reports, the television network acted on numerous comments from netizens that the teleserye will be verging towards racism. It might send a message that real beauty can only be found in people with fair complexion. Netizens were concerned the show might affect the values of dark-skinned young ladies. In Japan, recent reports of black faces and race-based reactions to the choice of a multiracial Miss Universe Japan, a woman of African descent, indicates that Japan struggles with racism. On YouTube, a video shows a group of Asian children playing a game with the punishment being placing charcoal on their faces. With each mistake in the game, the children's skin grows darker and darker. Just earlier this month of August 2019, in a championship game of the Philippine Basketball Association, by making a motion imitating a monkey, one of the Philippine players publicly teased and mocked the opposing import player who was of African descent. The Philippine Basketball Association fined this basketball player and later apologized for his poor exercise in judgment. The stereotyping taking place in Asia is an unacceptable phenomenon. Asian ignorance of the world and of Africans does not help the effort to address the matter of stereotyping. Asia fails to consider the African perspective. It lacks an awareness of the African contributions to Asian society. A purist attitude in Asia prevents a more inclusive society that is open to diversity. In Korea, for example, there is a belief that all Koreans originated from just one person. Thus, those who have different features are not readily accepted. A history of European colonization has also introduced European values that do not take into account the African view of the world. Global media, in its pervasiveness, has reinforced these European values that give little importance to African characteristics. Stereotyping must be dealt with by law in a way similar to hate speech. Hate speech attacks a person on the basis of race or other attribute. Both forms of expression, negative stereotyping and hate speech, fall outside protected speech. Criminal sanctions must be imposed not just for hate speech but also for stereotyping. Furthermore, as for hate speech, stereotyping ought to be a basis for damages. Administrative sanctions should also be imposed for words and images that amount not only to hate speech but also to stereotyping. From the point of view of development, the third theme of the International Decade for People of African Descent, the cities of India are people of African descent who live at the fringes of society, descended from enslaved Africans. From generation to generation, poverty is their daily reality as they face serious institutional and structural obstacles to access their economic, social, and cultural rights. Similarly, the rights to health, education, housing, and employment of African asylum seekers in Indonesia and Malaysia are among those compromised or are at risk of being violated. In Indonesia and Malaysia, African asylum seekers arriving undocumented are officially not allowed to work, receiving no financial support for housing or food they need to find illegal work to support themselves and their families, informal work, which makes them vulnerable to exploitation. Some asylum seekers work for employers and provide makeshift housing where they work long hours for minimal pay. Somalis, Sudanese, and other African refugees belonging to small refugee communities in particular face hardship finding work, often relying on family and friends resettled in the West for survival. Asylum seekers also see their children miss out on education and the opportunities that it makes available. There are also reports of racism from potential employers and landlords. Mental health issues as a result have been reported. For African American military servicemen and women in Asia, the stigma experienced by their children is a compelling one. Amerasians are children of American soldiers stationed in American facilities in different parts of Asia. In Asia, there are American military facilities, or there have been in China, Korea, Vietnam, American military facilities and forces in different parts of Asia. These Amerasians include Amerasians, African Amerasians, living at the fringes of Asian society, perceived to be children of sex workers and discriminated on account of their race. They face a risk of violation of several of their human rights, including their economic, social, and cultural rights. The Philippines is a striking case study of Amerasians. The Philippine Amerasians were once estimated at 52,000. Now estimates of abandoned offspring of U.S. military servicemen and women are at 250,000. As Peter Kuchera asserts, their ranks are expanding slowly but exponentially. I will wrap up now.
Thank you.
Counted as well are those sired since American occupation and Commonwealth years to the present joint U.S.-Philippines military exercises. Philippine aberrations are not only in their 30s or 40s, but can also be geriatrics and newborns. Kuchera traces military origin of Philippine aberrations back to the United States occupation in the Philippines in 1898. In estimating the number of Philippine aberrations, Kuchera includes the eventual offspring of original abandoned children of United States-based base occupants. There are three continuing sources: the joint U.S. military Balikatan shoulder-to-shoulder military training exercise, the ongoing and often highly classified U.S. military operations supporting Philippine armed forces, the Philippine sex industry entertainers who are impregnated by military contractors and servicemen at clubs surrounding U.S. bases in Japan, South Korea, Guam. Now, Kuchera suggests that the revision of the estimate to 250,000 makes the Philippine aberrations a candidate for a diaspora on several levels. As an aside, in the early presence of African-American soldiers in the Philippines, a striking story is that of David Fagan, an African-American soldier in the United States Army stationed in the Philippines during the Philippine insurrection against American rule. He defected to U.S. Filipino freedom fighters. All right. There's also the story of a Pittsburgh Steeler who won the most valuable player award, Heinz Ward, who is a Korean African. He was born in Korea. He was not recognized initially as a Korean citizen because Houston Guinea is applied in Korea only on the paternal side. In conclusion, let me just say quickly that the International Decade for People of African Descent, may serve as an important tool for addressing issues of racial discrimination against Africans in Asia. Greater efforts may be exerted to promote the decade in the region. The official launch of the decade in Asia could contribute to this endeavor. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mr. Tsonga, for this analysis of Afrophobia, racism against people of African descent throughout the Asian region. This is a very little known issue for many, and I'm very grateful that you made time to join us and share about this phenomenon. Now, before we move to the question and answers, we have the last but not least speaker. It's Mr. Amal DeChickera. He is one of the co-directors of the Institute on Statelessness and Inclusion, and he leads the Institute's human rights engagement work and plays on an important part in the Institute's work on childhood statelessness, gender discrimination, and the Sustainable Development Agenda. Statelessness, as he will be explaining, is about deprivation of nationality. It's about people who don't have any nationality. And one way in which racism manifests itself in various parts of the world is when an entire community are stripped of their nationality and therefore rendered completely vulnerable. So please, Amal, the floor is yours, and let us know a little bit about the Asian context.
Thank you very much, Segma, for the kind introduction, and it's a pleasure to be at this webinar with other speakers and to have listened to all of you before me. I want to start by just marking the fact that yesterday, the 25th of August, was the second anniversary of the clearance operations in Myanmar, which is now widely known as Rohingya Genocide Day. It was the day which basically marked the forced expulsion of hundreds of thousands of Rohingya, close to 1 million Rohingya from Myanmar to Bangladesh. And it was a day which started the process, which now has widely been recognized as being a genocide of the Rohingya community. The Rohingya are stateless. They're probably the group who are best known internationally for being stateless. And they are also the group for whom the consequences and implications of statelessness are most clearly evident. But I think when talking about the Rohingya, when talking about the history of racism and genocide against the Rohingya, it's important to also look beyond and before August 25th, 2017, at a long-term and systemic structure of discrimination and racism against the Rohingya, which led to where we are today. And I say this because I think this is quite instructive of the manner in which racism interplays with identity politics, with nationality and citizenship and belonging. And it really demonstrates the mutually reinforcing values of racism and imposed statelessness as going hand in hand and marginalizing some of the most vulnerable communities in the world and certainly in Asia. So if you take this longer lens historical view of the Rohingya, you will find that, and I'm not going to give the whole history, but you will find that the Rohingya lived as citizens of Myanmar, albeit citizens who faced discrimination and faced racism in various ways, and citizens who, particularly since the military junta took over in 1962, whose belonging was increasingly questioned. And the 1982 Citizenship Law, which was passed in Myanmar, which is a racist law, which sets out 135 ethnic groups who are deemed to be Burmese citizens by right, excluded the Rohingya and also excluded other groups. And what this law and the manner in which it was subsequently implemented did was it eroded and attacked the very identity of the Rohingya, their very history. It labeled this group as Bengalis, as illegal immigrants from Bangladesh, and it basically justified the xenophobia, the racism against the Rohingya on the basis that they were not Burmese. And here you see this mutually reinforcing connection, where imposed statelessness through the deprivation of nationality justifies racism and is used to further perpetrate racism. In other words, the Rohingya were always discriminated against, but by declaring them stateless, by declaring that they are not Burmese, the justification for the detrimental treatment of the Rohingya is that they are not ours. They should not be here. They are illegal. They are from Bangladesh. Therefore, it is within our right to hate them. It is within our right to limit their freedoms, and it is also within our right to ultimately commit genocide against them. If you look at statelessness as a kind of an international phenomenon, what you see is that basically a stateless person is someone who does not have citizenship of any country under the operation of its law. And you look at the communities which have the largest stateless populations, and you will find that these tend to be minorities. And this is not an accident. It is because of this very strong nexus between racism, discrimination, and statelessness. The idea that by determining who falls within and therefore who falls without, a state has at its disposal a very powerful tool to exclude unwanted minorities. And so you also see a strong connection between statelessness and histories of colonization and colonialism, whereby either minorities who were within a country when the colonizers arrived, groups who became minorities because of the arrival of colonizers, or groups who were brought into countries post-colonization as labor and for other reasons. Once the colonization process has ended and the countries regain independence, those groups remain very much at the periphery, and they are fair game, for want of a better word. This isn't always the case. It isn't always a history of colonialism, but certainly there's a strong link between histories of colonialism and statelessness. One interesting thing about statelessness is that the determining characteristic of statelessness then becomes a further basis on which people are discriminated against. So it's no longer just their characteristic as a minority, but it's also your characteristic as a stateless person. And if I was to look slightly further afield from the Asia Pacific region, just into the border, into the neighboring Middle East region, you see this as being very much the case in Kuwait, where the stateless Bidun are not a minority in that they're not a defined ethnic group. They basically are those who were never registered at a census when Kuwait formed itself as a state, and they're descendants. But by virtue of becoming labeled as the Bidun, this group has increasingly been treated as a minority and increasingly being ostracized and prejudiced and disadvantaged societally. So we see this very strong nexus. I also wanted to raise one more example, which is a forgotten one of Bhutan. Bhutan is a country which benefited from migration from Nepal since the 19th century, where many Nepalis went over to Bhutan and they worked and they became a part of the labor force. And the 1958 Citizenship Law of Bhutan recognized this quite substantive community as Bhutanese. But then as the country became more insular looking and more nationalistic in its outlook, a law in 1985 deprived this community of their citizenship. It resulted in a mass expulsion of refugees back to Nepal. Many of them have since been resettled in third countries, but there are still tens of thousands of ethnic Nepalis living in Bhutan whose citizenship is under a cloud and who face various degrees of exclusion and denial of rights. If you look at the landscape in other parts of Asia, you have the Bajau Laut, who are also colloquially known as the Sea Gypsies, who live in the sea between Malaysia, Indonesia, and the Philippines, and their nomadic lifestyle and their lifestyle on the sea means that this is a community who do not neatly fit within our nation-state paradigm, and therefore they have been viewed with suspicion by all three of these states, and many of them have been denied their citizenship and are stateless. You look at ethnic Tamils, Tamils of Indian origin in Sri Lanka and in Malaysia, groups that were brought to Sri Lanka and Malaysia to work on tea plantations. Whilst the issue in Sri Lanka has been largely addressed from a legal perspective, what you see is that 15 years on, in 2003, a law was passed which granted citizenship to all Tamils of Indian origin in Sri Lanka. But 15 years on, by all development indicators, this community continues to be the most marginalized, the most disadvantaged in the country. And what that shows is that there's also a much longer term legacy and impact of statelessness on minorities that have endured statelessness and discrimination for decades. And that's resolving statelessness and granting citizenship to groups by and of itself is not an adequate solution to the problem. Because basically you're dealing with communities who have over generations been subjected to very targeted exclusion and discrimination. And just the legal granting of status does not in any way eradicate or address societal attitudes towards these communities. Neither does it address the very real material disadvantage in terms of access to education, healthcare, access to labor, just wealth of the community and political participation, and just by any paradigm, whatever it may be, legal reform alone is inadequate to resolve these matters. And so we at the Institute on Statelessness and Inclusion believe that when working on behalf of the rights of stateless people, when working on behalf of the rights of stateless minorities, and particularly those who have been made stateless as a result of racism and discrimination and xenophobia, that it is a long game. It is a multifaceted approach that's required, both in terms of challenging discriminatory laws, challenging unjust practices, and seeking legal and policy reform, but also engaging with societal attitudes, challenging stereotypes and prejudices, and ultimately ensuring that stateless people who have been denied their rightful place at the table, often for generations, are recognized as equals, and that those of us working in the professional sphere take our direction from them, are accountable to them, listen to them, and as much as possible, we create the space for representatives of stateless minority communities to actually take their case to the international arena, to national arenas, and to fight for their rights, with us playing a more supportive role from the background. Unless this happens, we believe that stateless people and other minorities will continue to be treated unequally and to be not recognized as equals in every sense of the word, even where the law provides for notional equality. And so this is our commitment as the Institute. And like I said, it's not an issue that's going to be resolved in a few years, in decades even, but it's an issue that requires our committed attention for I think the foreseeable future. I will stop there, but I'll be very happy to engage in discussion with the fellow panelists and other participants.
Thank you very much, Amal, for this very insightful presentation, sharing with us, reminding us that this is the second anniversary of the tragic developments that affected the Rohingya community in Myanmar, that caused them to find refuge in neighboring countries, and mainly Bangladesh, actually. Thank you so much to each and every one of you speakers for the very insightful and rich presentations. We have a question from one of our participants, who happens to be my colleague Dinesh Suna, and I will also ask another question, and then I will ask each one of you to respond to both questions, because we are almost at the end of the webinar, but I think if you all agree, we can take another 10 minutes to go through these two questions. So Dinesh, can you share your question with the speakers, please? Dinesh? Well, I see his microphone is deactivated, but I can hear him. So maybe I will read his question, which he shared in the chat room. Listening to the experiences and concepts of various forms of discrimination and xenophobia based on race, caste, work and descent, and ethnicity, there are commonalities. Can we not use a common platform to address these issues and generate international solidarity and pressure groups for advocacy? So that's Dinesh's question. And my question to you would be, can you identify some main drivers for this resurgence of racism and xenophobia that we are not witnessing not only in the Asian context, but also in other parts of the world? Racism is really high on the agenda these days. And what is, according to you, the factors behind? So these are the two questions, and I would invite the speakers to give us their reflection on these two questions. Who would like to go first?
Okay, I'll have a go at both those. I made a comment back to Dinesh on the chat line that, and if we've listened to each of the speakers tonight, this is a complicated set of issues, and while there are similarities that we all share, there are peculiarities in the time and the place and the context in which people are in. And often those particularities are the major issues for people, because they're the issues that are right in their face. And therefore, it sometimes gets in the way of us dealing together with the same set of issues, because we have particular issues that stand in front of us. Death in custody in Australia, which would be a big issue for Aboriginal people, it may be a slightly different issue than it is for other people. So I think it's complicated, but I think what we're doing, these kind of discussions where we get a chance to hear the stories from other places and we begin to understand that there are similarities, that our situation isn't the only one, is the beginning to work towards a platform. And I think that's very important. Our last speaker was spot on. It's a long game. We play the long game, and we play the long game of talking to one another, of spreading the word about our own issues and finding solidarity amongst each other to help us to understand the options we have to resolve some of these. Your other question, I think, here in Australia, what I see is that it's what I call neo-colonial nostalgia. There is still this sense that while white colonialism has in some ways disappeared in what is supposed to be a post-colonial society, we've ended up with the same set of discrimination and racist and genocidal practices, but practiced in a far more, and this is the Australian situation, a far more polite and appropriate manner. And it's nostalgia that aches back to the full colonial process. People want to return to where they have the power. They can't have the power here in the same way as they did before, but they're finding ways to continue it. And then the other issue that I find also is that people tend to flatten people's experiences of these issues. If you talk about in Australia racist issues, racism as experienced, genocide as continued to be experienced, people go, oh, but that's what happens to everybody who's a minority, or there is this levelling out to sort of say it's like my experience. People don't have an understanding of the depth of the problem. So I think there's a couple of big issues that we have to address.
Okay, thank you very much, Glen, for these very helpful remarks. Anyone else? Dr. Rao, maybe? Can you unmute your mic, please? Yes.
The similarities between the various groups I find is that we didn't talk about it, but I think within the group itself, there are groups that are voiceless. Even within the Dalit groups, there are the women that are voiceless, there are the children that are voiceless, there are Christians within them that are voiceless. I think we need to give space to these people to speak up. So there's solidarity in the Dalit group itself. Otherwise, the group itself is fractured. So I think building up bridges within the group to combat, to develop strategies together is something that I would maybe find common ground with other groups also.
Okay, excellent. And also maybe solidarity with Dalit experiences in other countries, in other contexts as well.
Yeah, bridging.
Absolutely, yes. David, would you like to comment on both questions or one of them?
Yes, certainly there are, I think, healthy conversations that take place in the ecumenical community. There are close links and a long history of people working together. So certainly continuing with that is important. I found here in Japan, just in the short 2.5 years that I have been in my current work, I've been very encouraged by my working with NGOs. There are a variety of NGOs that are working on specific areas. There is a good network of NGOs that have almost monthly meetings, and we work together to advocate on the international stage, for example, with the United Nations, the various human rights commissions that fit under the United Nations umbrella. When I was speaking of the Buraku people earlier, there are at least 2 or 3 Buddhist sects that have sort of taken a confessional stance in the Buddhist church's role in creating and maintaining discrimination, and they have strong educational programs that in some cases we have worked with them in developing and taking out to our various audiences. So certainly continuing to look for allies in new places is something that we can also continue to do, and perhaps the kinds of things that I just said is something that might be of interest to share in the Christian ecumenical community as well, as examples of something that is happening here that perhaps might stimulate somebody to try something new somewhere else.
Thank you. And in terms of the drivers behind the resurgence of so much xenophobia and discrimination, would you have some comment on that?
My immediate thought is just the world being what it is, just a faster and faster changing place. I think we can't ignore the sort of the psychological aspect of just people feeling uncertain about the future when things are changing so fast. And one of our human failings is that we look for things that we can see, things that are visible to blame our insecurities on, and so I think that's one aspect that needs to be remembered and tackled on the one hand. I also think there's some relationship to, at least in the societies that I move from place to place, in the societies that I'm familiar with, there is a growing inequality in wealth and privileges and so on, and I think there is perhaps a deliberate effort made by those who are in these growing concentration, these spheres of concentrated power that are using populist sentiments to basically deflect attention from the things that are really really deep problems that affect us all.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much.
Those are my comments.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Can I follow up on that by saying that here in Australia, Aboriginal people have never been a part of have never been accepted as part of the cultural environment in 250 years. We have suffered genocide and been marginalised so that the rest of society was able to point the finger at those people who were less than the rest of the population. I mean, in the first 100 years of the colonisation, 87% of all Aboriginal people in this country were wiped out. In some cases, 100%. So we're dealing with here a fact that we still, and the fact that we still have never ceded our sovereignty to our country. The process amongst our people is to continue to take us out of the picture so that we don't exist and we are not a part of the community, no matter how much successful we may be individually. But as a group of people, we simply don't exist.
Yeah. Thank you so much for sharing about this continued struggle. Mr.
If I may add.
Sorry?
Yeah. If I may add, if it's all right.
Yes.
I was just thinking about what seems to be common in all of the stories is this lack of understanding of the minorities. In the case of my presentation, of people of African descent. there's this pressing need for a greater appreciation for the contributions of the minorities, people of African descent, their historical and contemporary contributions, for instance, in the areas of the military service, economy, the arts, the sciences. If you can have that greater appreciation, perhaps we will be moving somehow further along forward. Another Asian phenomenon that I have seen, I'm not sure if the other speakers will share in this observation, is that in Asia, what is happening is that there is this assimilation.
Mm-hmm.
So there is this inability to see, to recognize people of African descent and the other minorities. There's this lack of data on them. Mm-hmm. And we have to count them, the minorities, the people of African descent, for them to be counted. We need a census, for instance, that will allow them to be counted, and as we propose in the working group, on the basis of a voluntary self-identification, so that we will have a better picture of the extent of the discrimination.
Okay. Thank you very much. And Amal, the final words and the comments on these two questions, please.
Thank you. I think that the other panelists have covered most of it. I think there's quite a strong interlinkage between the two questions, actually, in that one of the reasons that we do see a resurgence of racism in this manner is also, if you were to take an introspective kind of approach to this, is also our failure to more effectively work with each other and to collectively combat these very damaging and problematic discourses that we see dominating the world. Just to pick up on Aishwarya's point, I think it's really crucial that we have an understanding and appreciation of intersectionality and intersectional discrimination and the role that it plays in impacting on people's life experiences. The idea that it's not just one aspect of your identity, but your collective identity and the way the world perceives you in different ways, which kind of influences your life experience. And I think what this intersectionality approach does demonstrate, or should demonstrate to us, is that we need each other, because we ourselves are not a singular thing. We are many things within ourselves, and the world is also many things. And unless we recognize that complexity both within ourselves and within our communities and within the wider world, and we recognize therefore the importance of working with people and speaking to people whose experience and priority may be slightly different to ours, but nonetheless that their wider objective is pursuing equality and justice and combating racism and discrimination. Unless we see the importance of doing that and take a step back, look at ourselves and make a very honest effort to do so, I think we are going to continue to struggle, because the world is moving in a more populist direction. We have these strongman leaders from Trump to Modi to Duterte to Erdogan, and I can go on. And it's very easy for these people to pit us against each other and to scapegoat the minorities and the migrants and the poor. And unless we're able to see that actually there is systemic discrimination which impacts the majority of the world, which is actually broken down into many minorities in different ways, we are not going to be successful, I think, in our efforts. So my kind of closing plea would be that we need to look more within ourselves, and we need to be reaching out and learning from each other in order to build stronger alliances.
Thank you very much, Amal, and thank you each one of you for taking time to join us during this webinar, and also for your insightful remarks and presentations. As I mentioned at the beginning, the webinar has been recorded. So for those who are not able to join us, we will make the link available later on. If others are willing to continue the conversation, we are encouraging them to do so via chat on WhatsApp, on our social media, be it on Twitter and also on Facebook. Thank you very much again for being with us. In 2 weeks' time, we will have another webinar, this time focusing on the North American context. So some of your remarks, David, will be shared during that webinar as well, especially as it relates to Indigenous communities in Canada and the US as well. And I really invite you, I know it won't be the same time zone as in Asia, it will be in the middle of the night for you, but you will get the chance to see the recording as well. And I'm hoping that there will be a possibility of connecting all these webinars and to see what are the common threads and how we can move further to work together as ecumenical family and other partners on this very burning and important issue. So thank you for those who have joined. Thank you for the speakers for making time. And this is the end of our webinar. Merci. Bye-bye. Bye, everyone.
Bye, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, and bye.